Abby Whitaker pressed her blistered palm flat against the old horse's neck and whispered, "Just one more pass, boy. Just one more." Behind her, every machine in Red Hollow had gone dead silent in the killing heat, and the same men who'd laughed at her father's 12 horses were about to come crawling to her fence. If you believe the people this world mocks are so often the very ones who end up saving it, subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I'd love to see just how far Abby's story travels. The rains had worn the skin clean off the inside of Abby Whitaker's fingers, and still she would not stop. She walked behind the team the way her father had taught her to walk steady and slow, never dragging, never hurrying her boots, finding the soft-turned earth between the rows. Sweat ran down the back of her neck and soaked the collar of a shirt that had once belonged to a husband 2 years in the ground. She didn't wipe it. She didn't slow. She talked to the horses instead low, and even the way you talk to something you love when you've got nothing left to give it but your voice. "Easy now, Samson, easy. You're doing fine." The big bay's ears swiveled back toward her, and that small thing, that flick of an ear, that animal listening to her in a world that had stopped listening years ago, put a knot in her throat she didn't have time for. 12 horses. That was what her father had left her. 12 horses, a stack of unpaid notes at the bank, and a strip of Kansas dirt that everybody in Red Hollow had already decided was worthless. Behind her, somewhere out past the fence line, a man laughed. She knew the laugh before she knew the man. Everybody in the county knew that laugh. It was the kind of laugh that had money behind it, the kind that came easy because nothing had ever cost the man who owned it. "Well, I'll be," Silas Crowley called out, reining his fine sorrel up at her fence. "Boys, come look at this. Come look. Widow Whitaker's out here playing like it's still her granddaddy's century." There were 4 of them strung along the rail. Crowley in the middle, fat and pink in a clean linen coat that no working man could keep clean, and 3 of his hands flanking him grinning because he grinned. Abby did not turn around. "You hear me, ma'am?" Crowley's voice carried over the creak of the cultivator and the soft thud of the horse's feet. "I'm trying to do you a kindness. The whole town's watching you break your back behind a string of dead men's mules while the rest of us moved on. It ain't dignified." "They're horses," Abby said. She didn't raise her voice, and she didn't stop walking. "Not mules. You'd know the difference if you ever did a day's work near one." One of the hands choked back a snort. Crowley's smile thinned just a hair. "Sharp tongue," he said. "Your daddy had one too. Look where it got him. Buried in debt. I'm still willing to take off your hands at a fair price." "Half a fair price," she said. "Fair's whatever a man'll pay, and I'm the only man payin'." That was the truth of it, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it sat between them in the hot air like a third living thing. Abby reached the end of the row. She turned the team slow patient, the off horse leaning into the collar, the way her father's journal said a good horse ought to, and started back the other direction. And now she was facing the fence, facing the 4 of them, and she let them see her face. It was a sunburned face, a hard face some would have said, though it hadn't always been. There were 2 graves behind it. A husband taken by a fever the doctor never named, and 10 months later, a father taken by his own worn-out heart. And between the 2 of them, they had taken just about everything soft that Abby Whitaker had ever owned. What was left was bone and salt, and a stubbornness that frightened weaker people. "You came a long way out of your road to laugh at me, Mr. Crowley," she said. "Must be I worry you." The smile dropped off his face entire. "Worry me," he said it flat. "Woman, I got 400 head of cattle, 2 steam pumps, a freight contract, and a line of credit at the bank that'd make your daddy weep. You got 6 tired horses in harness and 6 more eatin' feed you can't pay for. The only thing worries me is having to look at it." "Then don't look," she said, and clicked her tongue, and the team leaned forward and she walked on. It should have ended there. With most men, it would have. But Silas Crowley was not a man who could stand being walked away from, least of all, by a widow in a dead man's shirt. And so he did the thing that men like him always do when their pride takes a cut. He went looking for the soft place. He went looking for the wound. "You know," he called after her. Folks say it was the grief that took old Eli's heart. But I heard different. I heard it was the shame. Heard he couldn't stand watching his own girl turn his ranch into a laughingstock. Abby stopped. She stopped, and for one long second, she did not move at all, and the only sound in the whole baking morning was a horse shifting its weight, and the buzz of a fly, and the creak of leather where her hand had closed too tight around the rein. Off to the side of the fence, where she hadn't even noticed him, because a quiet man has a way of going unnoticed, next to a loud one, Caleb Mercer pushed off the post he'd been leaning on and took one step forward. Just one. But it was the kind of step a man takes when he's deciding something. Mercer was a horsebreaker by trade, the best in 3 counties. The sort of man whose name got spoken with respect, even by people who didn't like him. He'd ridden out that morning with Crowley's crowd the way a man rides out with the only company a hard country offers, not because he counted them friends. He'd been watching the widow work for the better part of an hour. He'd watched how she rested the team at the turn before they asked to be rested. He'd watched her water the off-horse from her own canteen before she'd taken a swallow herself. He'd come out here half believing what the town believed, that she was a proud, foolish woman, too stubborn to know the world had passed her by. He didn't believe it anymore. He'd known it the moment she watered that horse before herself. You couldn't fake that. You couldn't learn it in a season. That was a thing a person carried in them bone deep from somebody who'd carried it before them. "That's enough, Silas," Mercer said. Crowley turned in the saddle, surprised. "Beg pardon." "I said that's enough." Mercer's voice was quiet, but it had a floor under it. "Man's dead. Leave him be. Since when do you take a widow's part, Mercer? Since you started kicking a grave to feel tall." For a moment the 2 men just looked at one another, and the 3 hands looked at their boots, because nobody wanted to be standing in the middle of whatever this was turning into. Abby's back was still to all of them. She hadn't turned around. But Mercer saw her shoulders, which had drawn up tight as fence wire, come down. Just a little. Just enough that he knew she'd heard him. "My father," Abby said to the horses, to the row, to nobody, "didn't die of shame." Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to. "He died tired. There's a difference, though. I don't expect a man who never tired in his life to know it." She clicked her tongue again. The team moved. Crowley opened his mouth to come back at her, but he never got the words out. Because that was when the boy came. They heard the horse before they saw it. A hard, ugly, run-out gallop, the kind of pace no rider asks of an animal unless something is badly wrong. Then the boy himself broke around the bend in the road, hatless, bent low over the neck of a lathered pony, hollering before he was even close enough to be understood. "Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, sir." It was the Hatcher kid, maybe 12 years old, who carried messages for half the businesses in Red Hollow for a nickel apiece. He hauled the blown pony to a sliding, scrambling stop at the fence, and the words came out of him in a flood, all run together, his chest heaving. "It's the cattle yard, sir. The big pump, the new one, it quit, sir. It just quit, and they can't get it going again, and the well by the freight road's gone dry, plumb dry, and the cattle in the south pens is going down, sir. They's already 3 or 4 down, and more looking poorly, and Mr. Dawson sent me to fetch you, 'cause nobody knows what to do." "Slow down." Crowley's voice had changed. The fat ease had gone out of it. "Slow down, boy. The pump quit. What about the spare?" "Spare's the one that quit yesterday, sir. That's why they was running the new one. Now they's both down, and the boiler man can't. And the Mill Creek well. Dry, sir. 2 days dry." Silas Crowley sat very still on his fine sorrel horse. The pink had gone out of his face. He was looking down the road toward town like a man who could already see the thing coming for him and couldn't make his hands move to stop it. 400 head. Abby knew the arithmetic as well as he did. Everybody in cattle country carried that arithmetic in their bones. 400 head in killing heat. No working pump. The nearest well dry, and the next reliable water. How many miles? Cattle didn't die slow in this kind of summer. They died by the dozen, by the hour, and a man who lost his herd to thirst lost more than money. He lost the herd and the contract that herd was promised to, and the credit that contract was holding up, and after that he lost the thing men like Crowley feared most, which was the look in other men's eyes. "Get the men on the boiler," Crowley said. His voice had gone thin. "Get every bucket in town, every barrel." "Buckets from where, sir?" the boy said, and it was an honest question, the terrible honesty of a child. "There ain't no water to put in 'em. The crick's mud. The horses on the freight teams is too poorly to haul. That's why Mr. Dawson said—" And here the boy stopped. He stopped because his eye had drifted the way a boy's eye drifts past Crowley and past the three silent hands out across the fence and landed on the field. On Abby Whitaker's field, where 6 big horses leaned steady into their collars and moved slow and certain through the standing corn the way they had moved at sunrise, and the way they would still be moving at noon, because horses do not have boilers to crack, and they do not run on water from a well that has gone dry. They run on grass and grain and rest and the patient hands of somebody who loves them, and Eli Whitaker's daughter had all 4. The boy's mouth came open. Slow like a thing being pulled, every man at that fence turned his head and followed the boy's eyes. And for the first time that morning, nobody laughed. 6 horses. Working. The only thing moving for as far as a man could see in any direction. No steam. No iron. No pump. Just 1,200 pounds of patient muscle apiece leaning into the work, and behind them a sunburned woman in a dead man's shirt, with the skin worn off her fingers, who had been told all summer long that she was a relic, a fool, a laughingstock, a thing the modern world had passed by. Silas Crowley looked at those horses, and something moved behind his eyes that he would have given his whole herd to hide. He looked at the only living things in 3 counties still strong enough to haul water, and they belonged to her. "Mrs. Whitaker," he began, and his voice? God, his voice had gone soft as butter, soft as a man's voice goes when he has just discovered he needs something he spent all summer spitting on. "Mrs. Whitaker, now I heard the boy," Abby said. She had stopped the team. She stood with one hand on Samson's broad rump, and she did not turn all the way around, only half just enough to show him the side of her face. "4 down already?" Crowley said. "More comin'. I got 400 head, ma'am, and not a drop to give 'em. Your animals, your horses, they're the only that is I'd pay. I'd pay well, you understand. Top dollar. For the use of the teams just for the day, just till we—" "This mornin'," Abby said. "I was a laughingstock." Crowley shut his mouth. "This mornin'," she went on, still in that low, even voice, the voice she used on a nervous colt. "You rode out of your way to tell me my daddy died of shame. To tell me I'm an embarrassment to a man 2 years dead." She turned the rest of the way around now, slow, and looked him full in the face. "And now you're sittin' on that fat horse, askin' me real polite for the loan of the very animals you've been laughin' at since the snow melted." Caleb Mercer had not moved from where he stood, but he was watching her now, the way a man watches something he didn't know was possible, and there was the beginning of a thing on his face that on a less careful man might have been called wonder. "It ain't about you and me," Crowley said, and a little of the old hardness was creeping back because pride dies hard in a man who has lived on it. "It's about them cattle. They didn't laugh at you. You'd let 400 head die of thirst to spite one man, and that Mercer saw it land, that one found something soft in her after all. Not because she cared a nickel for Silas Crowley's profits, but because she could not stand the thought of any living thing dying of thirst within reach of help, and the cruelest thing about Crowley was that he knew it, and he had reached straight in and used it. Abby's jaw worked. She looked away from him, out toward the south, toward town, toward the unseen pens where animals were going down in the heat, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. "No," she said finally, "I wouldn't." Crowley let out a breath. "Then we're agreed. I'll send the men back and you bring the teams down and—" "I didn't say you could have my horses." The breath died in his chest. "You heard the boy same as I did," Abby said. "Cattle going down in killin' heat, panicked, half mad with thirst. You'd run my teams into that to haul water for men who don't know how to handle 'em. Drive 'em till they founder, work 'em till their hearts give out, same as you work everything, till it gives out Mr. Crowley men and horses and widows and land both. I've seen how your hands treat stock." She shook her head slow. "No, sir, you're not getting my horses. Then those cattle die," Crowley said, and his voice cracked clean down the middle. "And it's on your head, woman. It's on your—" "They don't die," Abby said. She drew a breath, and what she said next, she said quiet. But every man at that fence heard it, and Caleb Mercer would remember the exact shape of the words for the rest of his natural life. "Because I'll bring them myself." Nobody spoke. The Hatcher boy's mouth was still hanging open. The 3 hired hands had gone still as posts. Silas Crowley sat on his fine sorrel horse and stared at the widow he had ridden out to humiliate not 20 minutes before, and he did not have one single word. "My horses," Abby said. "My hands. I'll work 'em the way they ought to be worked, and I'll rest 'em when they need restin', and not one of your men lays a quirt on a single one of 'em. Or I turn the whole team around and ride home, and you can dig 400 graves. Those are my terms. You don't like 'em, you find somebody else's horses still standin'." She looked down the empty, silent road, where not one other living team moved in all that heat, and then she looked back at him. "I'll wait." For a moment, Crowley's face went through about 4 different things at once: fury and shame and a calculation, and underneath all of it, the plain, naked fear of a man watching his whole life start to come apart in the heat. And then the calculation won, because it always won with him, and he gave one short, jerking nod. "Fine," he said. "Fine. Your terms. Say it like you mean it. Your terms, Mrs. Whitaker." It came out of him like a tooth. Abby nodded once. Then she turned her back on him, entire finished, as a door closing, and began unhitching the team from the cultivator with quick, sure, practiced hands, talking low to the horses the whole time, telling them they'd done good, telling them there was harder work ahead, but she'd see them through it, the way you talk to something you love when you've got nothing left to give it but your voice and your hands and your whole stubborn heart, and every last thing your father ever taught you on the days nobody was watching. It was Caleb Mercer who came over the fence. He didn't go around to the gate. He put a hand on the top rail and swung over it easy and crossed the turned ground to where she worked, and he took off his hat. Not the small, polite tip a man gives a woman in the street, but all the way off, held against his chest, and he stood there a second before he spoke like a man making sure of his own words before he turned them loose. "Ma'am," he said, "I rode out here this morning with the wrong men." Abby didn't look up from the buckle she was working. "Most folks do in this town." "I've been watching you near an hour." He turned the hat slow in his hands. "Watched you water that off-horse before you took a drink yourself. A man don't learn that. Somebody puts it in you young, or it ain't ever in you at all." He paused. "Your daddy put it in you, I expect." The buckle came free under her fingers. Abby went still for half a breath. Then she went on to the next one. "You expect right," she said, and her voice was not quite as steady as it had been. "I'd like to ride with you," Mercer said. "Down to them pens. I know cattle, and I know how a panicked herd moves, and I won't lay a hand on your teams except how you tell me to. You'll need somebody at the heads of the leaders in that kind of work, and you can't be at the head and the lines both." He held the hat against his chest. "I'm asking, ma'am, not tellin'. There's a difference. I reckon you're a woman who knows the difference." Abby straightened up. She looked at him, then really looked at him, this quiet horsebreaker who had stepped forward when the others laughed, who had taken off his hat, who had asked instead of told. She looked at his hands, a horseman's hands, scarred and careful, and she looked at his eyes, and she did not find in them the thing she had braced herself to find, which was pity. There was no pity in Caleb Mercer's face. There was only respect plain, and a little stunned the respect of one careful person recognizing another across the wreckage of a town that valued neither of them. "Can you keep your mouth shut and your hands soft?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Can you take an order from a woman without it sticking in your craw?" The corner of his mouth moved. "I reckon I'm about to find out." And Abby Whitaker, who had buried a husband and a father inside of a single year, who had been laughed at all summer long by every soul in Red Hollow, who had been told that very morning that her own father died of the shame of her, looked at the one man in the whole county who had stepped forward and felt something in her chest that she had thought the graves had taken for good. She didn't have a name for it yet. She didn't have time to find one. "Then get the lead horses out of the barn," she said, "and quit standing there with your hat off like somebody died. We've got a long way to go before that sun gets high, and I aim to bring every one of these animals home alive." Caleb Mercer put his hat back on his head, and he went to get the horses. The barn doors stood open before Caleb Mercer reached them, because Abby had already sent the youngest of the hired boys ahead to throw the bolt and inside in the close dark. 6 more horses lifted their heads and turned their ears toward the sound of her boots the way the first 6 had turned in the field. "Easy," she said, going down the row, laying a hand on each neck as she passed, naming them under her breath, the way her father had named them to her when she was a girl too small to reach their withers. "Easy, Duke. Easy, Pilot. We're going to work." Caleb came in behind her and stopped just inside the door, and she heard him stop. Heard the breath go out of him, and she knew what he was looking at without turning around. 12 horses, even split between barn and field, even with 6 of them gone gray at the muzzle, and one of them favoring a near hind that had never set right after a wire cut 3 winters back. They were the kind of teams a horseman dreamed about and never owned. Deep through the chest, clean in the leg. Gentled so soft a child could have walked under their bellies. Stock like this didn't happen by accident. It happened across 20 years of one man's patience, and then it happened across 2 more years of his daughter refusing to let go of him. "Lord," Caleb said quietly. "Lord, ma'am, I'd heard, I didn't believe." "Heard what?" "That Eli Whitaker bred the best heavy horses west of the Missouri and died too poor to keep a roof patched." He came down the row, slow hat in his hand again, and stopped at the big gray's head, and the gray dropped its nose into his palm and breathed him in. Folks said it like it was funny. "Folks say a lot of things like they're funny," Abby said. She pulled a set of harness off the wall, and the leather creaked, oiled and supple, not a crack in it, every buckle sound. A poor woman's harness. A poor woman who fed her horses before she fed herself, and oiled their leather before she mended her own coat. "Get the gray and the bay collared. Mind the gray's left ear, he don't like a hand coming at it from behind." He minded the gray's left ear. She watched him out of the corner of her eye while she worked, watched his hands, and what she saw settled something in her that had been standing on edge since he came over the fence, because a man's hands don't lie about him. Crowley's hands grabbed. His men's hands grabbed, jerked, hurried, the kind of handling that taught a horse to flinch before it was touched. Caleb Mercer's hands asked. They waited. They let the animal come to them. By the time she had the bay collared, the gray was leaning into him like an old friend, and she thought, against her own will, against 2 years of letting nothing soft into her at all, there it is. "That's the thing my father had. That's the thing I thought died with him." "You break horses for a livin'," she said. It wasn't a question. "I do." "Then you know what it costs to make 'em like this." She nodded down the row. "And you know it can't be bought back once it's beat out of 'em. So when we get down to them pens and Crowley's men come at my teams the way they come at everything, you remember whose hands these horses learn to trust. And you keep those men off." "Yes, ma'am. I mean it, Mr. Mercer. I'll lose the cattle before I'll lose a horse." "Crowley don't believe that about me." "You'd best." Caleb buckled the last strap and straightened, and he looked at her across the gray's broad back in the dark of the barn, and something passed over his face that she couldn't read and didn't have time to. "I believe it," he said. "I believed it the second you said you'd bring 'em yourself." They led the teams out into the white morning light, and the men at the fence had not gone anywhere. Crowley was still horsed, still pink, still sweating through his clean coat, and his 3 hands had drawn together the way men draw together when they've watched their boss take a cut he can't take back. The Hatcher boy had wheeled his blown pony to ride word back to town, and word Abby knew would travel faster than any horse the widow Whitaker's bringing her teams. The laughingstock's comin' to save the cattle. You won't believe it, come and see. And by the time she got those horses to the south, Penn's half of Red Hollow would be lining the road to watch her do it, or watch her fail. She let them line it. She'd been watched all summer. Let them watch this. "You'll want to bring 'em down the freight road," Crowley said, as she came through the gate, and his voice had found a little of its old bottom now, a little of the man who liked to tell people where things went. "Straight down past the Mill Creek crossin', and—" "I'll bring 'em the way I bring 'em," Abby said. "It's my cattle woman. And they're my horses, and right now your cattle need 'em a sight more than your horses need you." She didn't even slow. "You can ride ahead and have your men clear every loose thing out of those pens that a panicked horse could foul a leg on. Buckets, harness, busted boards, anything. You do that for me, and you'll have done one useful thing today." For a second she thought he'd come back at her. She watched the want to do it move across his face. But there was the road full of his dying cattle at one end of it, and there was no other team in 3 counties at the other, and so Silas Crowley, cattle buyer holder of notes, the richest and meanest man in Red Hollow, reined his fine sorrel horse around and rode ahead to clear buckets out of a pen because a widow told him to. Caleb Mercer made a sound beside her that he turned into a cough. "Something funny, Mr. Mercer?" "No, ma'am," he said. "Nothing at all. Just never in my life seen a man hate doing a thing as much as he wanted to do it." And that, though neither of them said so, was the first time in 2 years that Abby Whitaker came anywhere close to a smile. They worked the teams down the road at a pace that ate ground without burning the horses, and as they went, the thing she had been holding off all morning came up in her anyway, the way the past comes up in a person when their hands are busy and their mind has nowhere else to go, and she found herself telling him. Not all of it. She wasn't a woman who told all of anything. But she told him enough in the flat, plain way she told things, and he rode beside her with his eyes on the road ahead, and listened the way few men knew how to listen, which was without once trying to fix it. She told him her father had come out to this country with nothing but a stud colt and a notebook, and that he'd built the best heavy stock in the territory out of patience and not much else, and that for 20 years it had been enough because in those years a good team was worth its weight to every farmer and freighter and rancher from here to the railhead. And then the steam came. The pumps and the engines and the threshers and the men who sold them, and chief among the men who sold them, or rather rented them by the season, at a price that bled a working family white, was Silas Crowley. "He didn't make a dime selling machines," Abby said. "He made his money renting 'em. You rent a man a steam pump cheap the first year, cheaper than he can buy one, and you tell him he's a fool to keep horses eating their heads off in the barn. So he sells his teams. He's got no teams now, you understand. He's got nothing but that rented pump. And the second year Crowley raises the rent, and the third year when the man's behind Crowley holds the note." She was quiet a moment. "My father saw it comin'. Most didn't. He used to say a machine'll always belong to the man who sold it to you, but a horse belongs to the man who feeds it. Folks laughed at that too. And your debts," Caleb said carefully. "The ones the town says broke him." Abby's jaw set. "My father borrowed against the ranch one time in his life, to buy back a section of his own bottomland that had been sold out from under him in a bad year before I was grown. A small note. He'd have paid it off in 3 good seasons." She looked straight ahead. "Then he died, and the note came due, and the man who bought it off the bank real quiet, real friendly 6 weeks after we buried him." She stopped. Caleb finished it low. "Crowley. Crowley." The word came out of her like something pulled. "He sat in my own kitchen, Mr. Mercer. 2 months a widow's daughter, and now a fatherless one, and that man sat at my own father's table and told me kind as anything that he'd take the whole place off my hands and call us square. Save me the shame of being sold up by the bank. Save me the shame." Her hands had gone tight on the lines, and she made them soft again for the horse's sake, because a horse feels everything that travels down a rein. "He's been at it ever since. Every few weeks he comes by with a number, and every few weeks the number's lower, and every time I say no, he tells half the county I'm a stubborn fool who's gonna lose it all anyway, so I might as well lose it to him. He's been waiting all summer for the heat to break me. He figured the drought'd do his work for him. Figured my horses would go down same as everybody's machines." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed, gone hard, and even in a way that made her glance at him. "He figured wrong," Caleb said. "He figured wrong about the horses," Abby said. "He didn't figure wrong about the rest of it. I'm 3 months behind on that note this minute, heat or no heat. Save every head of cattle in this county today, and I'm still 3 months behind come mornin'." She faced forward again. "So don't go thinking this is the day everything turns Mr. Mercer. It ain't. It's just the day I bring the horses." But she was wrong about that, and she would spend a long time after being glad she was wrong, because the day she brought the horses turned out to be the day a great many things began to turn, and the first of them turned not a quarter-mile farther on, at the Bell place, where Martha Bell came running out into the road with her apron in her hands. "Abby!" The old woman was breathless, gray hair come loose, a widow herself and not a strong one, and she ran out to the road and grabbed the bridle of the lead horse with a familiarity that told Caleb these two had stood in hard places together before. "Abby, child, is it true the Hatcher boy come through hollerin' you was taking your teams down to Crowley's pens?" "It's true, Martha. To Crowley's." Martha Bell said the name like it tasted bad. "After what that man Abby, after what he's done to you, you're taking your father's horses to save that snake's cattle." And here was a thing Caleb Mercer would carry with him, because here was where he understood what kind of woman he had thrown in with. Abby looked down at the old widow holding her horse's head, and she said, "It ain't his cattle I'm savin', Martha. It's 400 head of dumb animals dyin' of thirst, because a vain man let his machines do his thinkin' for him. The cattle never laughed at me. The cattle never sat at my daddy's table." She reached down and put her blistered hand over Martha Bell's spotted one on the bridle. "I can't make myself hate a thing and to die in a thirst, not even his. I tried. I can't do it. Reckon that's my whole trouble in this life." Martha Bell's eyes filled. "Your daddy used to say the very same." "I know it. You're a better Christian than this town deserves, child." "I ain't a better anything," Abby said. "I'm just too stubborn to let a thing die when I've got the means to keep it livin'. Now turn loose my horse, Martha, the sun's climbin', and I aim to be home by dark with every one of these animals on its own 4 feet. She paused. "And bolt your house. There's gonna be half the county out on that road today, and not all of 'em the kind you want lookin' in your windows." She rode on, and Caleb rode beside her, and he didn't say anything for a while, and then he said, "You help her, Martha Bell, regular. She's got no man and no sons, and a quarter section she can't work alone," Abby said. "I bring a team through twice a season, and we get her crop in. She pays me in eggs and what she can spare, which most seasons is nothin'." She shrugged a small, hard movement. "It's what neighbors do. Used to be anyhow. Before everybody decided neighborin' was a thing you could rent by the season, same as a steam pump. Crowley know you help her. Crowley knows everything that happens in this county. He keeps a ledger in his head meaner than the one at the bank." She glanced over. "Why?" "Just thinkin'," Caleb said slowly, "that a man like that don't like a woman he's trying to break to go around showin' the county she's the one holdin' it together. Makes his number look like the robbery it is." He looked at her. "You been making him look bad all summer, ma'am. Every time you put a team in some poor family's field for the price of nothing, you've been making Silas Crowley look like exactly what he is in front of the only people whose opinion he can't buy. That ain't gonna sit. A man like that don't sit at all." And Abby Whitaker, who had spent the whole summer thinking she was simply enduring Silas Crowley's contempt, felt something cold walk up her spine, because she understood all at once that she had not been enduring it. She had been provoking it. Every kindness she'd done in the open had been a slap she hadn't known she was throwing. And a man who took a slap like that didn't come back with a lower number. He came back with something worse. She didn't have time to think it through, because the road bent and the South Pens came into sight. And what was waiting there drove every other thought clean out of her head. It was worse than this boy had said. It was always worse than the boy said. The pens stood in the full killing sun, with not a stick of shade in them, and the cattle inside were not bawling anymore, which was the thing that turned her stomach. Because cattle that bawl are cattle that still have the strength to be afraid. These had gone past it. They stood with their heads down, and their tongues out, and their flanks heaving. Packed too tight and along the rails, Crowley's men moved with the useless desperation of people who have always had a machine do their work, and have suddenly been handed a job that can only be done with patience and skill and time and water, 3 of which they didn't have, and the 4th of which they'd never learned. Down at the far end, against the rails, lay the ones that were already down. Abby counted them without meaning to. 5 now. 2 of them not moving at all. "God Almighty," Caleb said softly. "Don't pray," Abby said. Work. But her own voice had gone tight, because she had not let an animal die of thirst in her life, if there was breath in her to stop it. And now there were 5 down, and 400 behind them, and the sun not even at noon. Silas Crowley came at her the second she rode up and gone. Now was every shred of the polite butter he'd put on at the fence. The fear had eaten it. "Where the hell have you been? It's been an hour. I got 2 more down since I sent the boy you said you'd—" "I said I'd come, and I'm here." Abby was already off her horse, already moving down the rail with a horseman's eye, reading the pens, reading the ground, reading the whole terrible problem, the way her father had taught her to read a problem, which was all at once and from the bottom up. "Where's your water? You got any water at all on this place, or did your pump break with the tank dry? There's the tank's maybe a quarter full, the big tank by the chute, but we can't get it to the pens. The pipe's part of the pump rig. It don't run without. It'll run on a horse and a barrel and a man who ain't afraid of work, which is why it ain't run all mornin'." She was already pointing, already ordering the flat snapping orders of a person who has thought 3 steps past everyone else in the conversation. "Mr. Mercer, get the gray and the bay on the stoneboat yonder. We'll run barrels off the chute tank to the pens. You?" This to one of Crowley's hands, a big slack-jawed man twice her size. "Quit standing there. Get them rails down on the south side so we can move the down cattle into shade if we have to drag 'em. You the tall one, you're on barrels with me. Mr. Crowley, now you listen." "Mr. Crowley," Abby said, and she stopped, and she turned and she looked at him, and there was not 1 ounce of give in her face. "You can take orders from me for the next 6 hours, or you can watch 400 head die while you stand there being the boss of nobody. Those are the choices. Pick one, quick." Behind her, Caleb Mercer had already swung the gray into the traces of the heavy sled, and somewhere out on the road drawn by the Hatcher boys hollering, the first wagons of the curious were coming into sight. Men and women of Red Hollow reining up along the rail to see whether the widow Whitaker would save the day or fail in front of all of them. And Silas Crowley looked at the gathering crowd, and looked at his dying cattle, and looked at the sunburned woman in a dead man's shirt, who had just told him to take an order or get out of the way. And for the second time that day, he made the only choice a drowning man can make. "What do you want me to do?" he said. It came out of him strangled. It came out of him in front of his own hands and the first dozen of his neighbors. And Abby, who could have made him pay for it, who had earned the right to make him pay for it 10 times over, did not even look up from the harness she was checking. "Get a shovel," she said, "and start digging a sump at the low end of the chute tank so we don't lose what drips. Every cup counts now. Go on, we're burning daylight." And Silas Crowley got a shovel. What followed the people of Red Hollow would talk about for the rest of their lives. Though most of them would tell it wrong, the way people always tell the things they only stood and watched. They would say, "The widow Whitaker worked a miracle." There was no miracle in it. There was a woman who knew horses, and a man who knew horses, and 10 others who learned fast, because the alternative was watching animals die. And there was the slow, brutal, unmiraculous labor of running water uphill, the old way, a barrel at a time, sledge after sledge, the gray and the bay leaning into it, and then the Duke and the pilot spelling them, so no team went past its strength, Abby calling the rests before the horses asked, watering them off the chute tank. 1 swallow each between loads, the same as she watered the cattle, because to her there was no difference. A thirsty thing was a thirsty thing, and she'd save the whole lot or none. She lost the 2 that were already past saving. She knelt by the second one herself when it went in the dirt in front of the whole crowd, and she put her hand on its neck, and she stayed there till it was gone, and then she got up and wiped her hands on her dead husband's shirt, and said, "2, we're not losing a third. Next barrel," and went back to work, and there was not a soul along that rail who watched her do it, and went on thinking she was a laughingstock. You could see it move through the crowd like weather. You could see the laughter die in people's faces, and something else take its place. Something that didn't have a name yet, but that would by nightfall, by morning, by next spring, have a name, and the name would be respect. Caleb Mercer worked at her shoulder the whole long, murderous afternoon, and barely said 3 words because the work didn't leave room for words. but every now and again swinging a barrel, hauling a rail. Throwing his back into it beside hers, he would look at her, and once, near the worst of it, when a young steer panicked and near went under the sledge and Abby got the team stopped and backed off it with a calm that made grown men's knees go weak, he heard himself say out loud to nobody, "I never seen anything like her in my life." And the slack-jawed Crowley hand who happened to be next to him heard it and said, sweating, hauling, "Me neither, mister. And I've been working for the man who hates her since spring." It was getting on toward evening. The worst of it behind them, the cattle off the edge of death and on to the long, slow road back to living the down ones up. But for the two in the dirt, when the thing happened that turned the whole day and the whole story in a direction nobody standing in that pen could have seen coming, a rider came down the road. Not at a panic this time. At a hard business-like trot, a man with a flat-crowned hat and a star on his vest, and the crowd along the rail parted for him, the way a crowd parts for the law, and Abby straightened up from the barrel she was tipping, with sweat running off her chin, and watched Marshal Thomas Reed ride into the yard and rein up and sit there looking at the scene in front of him. The saved herd, the working teams, the widow black with dust, and the rich man with a shovel, like a man trying to make a ledger balance in his head. "Mrs. Whitaker," the marshal said. "Marshal, heard from about 15 people you was down here." He took off his hat, wiped his forehead, put it back. He was an honest man and a careful one, the kind who moved slow because he'd learned the hard way that moving fast got the wrong people hurt. "Heard you brought your teams down to save Crowley's herd after the summer he's give you." His eyes went to Silas, standing there with the shovel sweated through shamed in front of his whole county, and something flickered in the marshal's face. "That true, Silas, she come down and saved your cattle. She come down," Crowley said, "and you could hear what it cost him, and lent her teams. For pay. There's a price agreed." "There's no price agreed," Abby said. The whole yard went quiet. "I told you this morning I'd bring 'em myself, and I did," she said, looking at Crowley. "And I'll take pay for the use of 'em, a fair pay, but I never agreed your price, and I never will, because your prices ain't fair and never have been, and I'll not have it said in front of the marshal and half the county that I did this for your money. I did it for the cattle. You owe me what's fair for a day's work of 12 horses and 2 people, and you'll pay it, and that's the end of it." And Silas Crowley, who had spent the whole day swallowing things he wasn't built to swallow, found that this was the one too many. Something in him broke loose. Maybe it was the shovel still in his hands. Maybe it was the marshal watching, and the crowd, and the slow horror of understanding that this woman had just saved his herd, and his contract, and his credit, and his good name, and made him look in the doing of it like exactly the small mean man he was. Whatever it was, it broke loose, and he did the worst thing he could have done, which was open his mouth. "Fair," he said, and it came out ugly. "Fair? You want to talk to me about fair, you stubborn? You'd be off this land already. If it was fair, you'd have took my offer in the spring like a sensible woman. 'Stead of dragging your dead daddy's name through every field in the county playing the saint. You think I don't know what you're doing? Lending your teams out for nothing. Making me look. I hold your note, woman. You hear me? I hold it. 3 months you're behind, and don't think I forgot it, just 'cause you hauled a few barrels of water. Come fall, I'll have your land, and your barn, and every one of them horses, and there ain't a thing in this world. Silas." The marshal's voice cut across it low, and there was something new in it, something that had gone very still and very cold. "Silas, hush a minute. But it was already out. It was out in front of 40 people. And Abby stood there in the dust with her ruined hands hanging at her sides and looked at the man who had just promised in front of the whole county to take everything she had, and she did not flinch and she did not weep, and the not flinching of her was a worse blow to Silas Crowley than any words could have been. "There it is," she said quietly. "There's the man under the manners. I've been waiting all summer for the county to see him. Reckon today's the day." "You hold her note," the marshal said slowly. He had got down off his horse now. He was looking at Silas in a way Silas didn't like, the careful, slow, honest way of a man who has just had two and two pushed together in front of him and is starting for the first time to get four. Eli Whitaker's note. You bought it off the bank. It was for sale, Crowley snapped. Anybody could have. How many, the marshal said. What? How many notes, Silas? Reed took a step forward. The crowd had gone dead silent now, every soul along that rail leaning in, because they could all feel it. The way you feel a floor start to give. I've been marshal in this county 6 years. In them 6 years, I have watched 11 families sold up and gone. The Hendrys, the old Pruitt place, the Larkins, the whole Mill Creek bottom. 11 families, Silas and every last one of them rented a machine off you the year before they lost the ground, and every last note ended up. He stopped. His honest face had gone gray. Ended up in your hands, quiet, after. I never put it together. God help me, I never once put it together, 'cause you was always so friendly about it, always saying you was just helping folks out, taking the burden off. You can't prove a all. I don't have to prove nothing yet, the marshal said. But I can write it down. 11 families. And a 12th standing right here that you just promised in front of the whole county, and an officer of the law to take everything from, after she saved your herd. He looked around at the crowd, at the 40 faces, and something passed between them and him, some current of a thing that had been wrong for years, and had just in one cracked open moment been seen for what it was. I reckon I'll be riding up to the county seat tomorrow. I reckon I'll be looking at some paper at the bank. And I reckon, Silas, you'd best have a real good answer for how a cattle buyer come to own near every ranch that ever went broke renting his machines. Silas Crowley stood in the middle of the pen with the shovel in his hand and the whole county looking at him, and for the first time in the memory of anyone present, the richest, meanest man in Red Hollow did not have one single word. Abby Whitaker watched it land. She watched the thing she had carried alone all summer. The certainty, the unprovable, unspeakable certainty that this man had built his fortune on the bones of broken families. She watched it walk out of her own private knowing and into the daylight where everyone could see it, and she did not feel triumph. She was too tired for triumph. What she felt standing there filthy and ruined and 3 months behind on a note that might or might not still be worth the paper come tomorrow was something quieter and far more dangerous to a man like Crowley. She felt the county turn. You couldn't see it happen, not all at once, but you could feel it the way you feel a herd shift in the dark. 40 people who had spent a whole summer laughing at the widow and tipping their hats to the cattle buyer stood at that rail and watched the cattle buyer threaten to ruin the widow who'd just saved his herd, and watched the marshal start to put the pieces of 11 dead families together in front of them. And something in all of them all at once came loose from Silas Crowley and drifted slow and certain toward Abby. She felt it come. She didn't want it. She'd never asked the county for a thing in her life. But she felt it come anyway, and she understood that whatever happened to her note, now whatever happened to her land, something between her and this town had changed today and would not change back. Caleb Mercer came and stood beside her. Close. Not touching, but close enough that the meaning of it was plain to everyone watching the horsebreaker, putting himself at the widow's shoulder in front of God and the county and Silas Crowley both. He had his hat in his hand. "You all right, ma'am?" he said low, just for her. "No," she said honestly. "But I will be." "That man," Caleb said, looking at Crowley, and his voice had gone quiet and even and absolutely certain, "ain't gonna take one thing off you. Not the land, not the barn, not one horse. You hear me? You can't promise me that, Mr. Mercer." "No," he agreed. "I can't. But I can promise you I'll be standing between you and him while we find out, and I'll promise you I ain't the only one." He nodded out at the rail at the 40 faces at the slow turning of the whole county. "You been carrying this alone all summer, 'cause you're too proud to ask and too kind to make 'em choose." "Well, ma'am, today they chose. You didn't ask 'em, and you didn't make 'em. They just stood here and watched you save the herd of the man trying to ruin you, and they chose." He put his hat back on. "Reckon that's worth more than any note at any bank." Abby Whitaker looked out at the people of Red Hollow. The people who had laughed, who had tipped their hats to Crowley, and turned their backs on her father's grave, who had called her a fool and a relic, and a stubborn woman too backward to know the world had passed her by, and she found to her own great surprise that she could not hate a single one of them either. The same trouble. The same whole trouble of her life. She was too stubborn to let a thing die, and too soft to let a thing stay dead, and standing there in the ruin of that long, murderous day, with 2 horses worth of grief still on her hands, and a note hanging over her head, and a broken man with a shovel 10 feet away, she felt the strangest thing rise up in her chest. The thing she'd thought the graves had taken for good. It was hope. She didn't trust it. She'd learned the hard way not to trust it. But it had come anyway, the way the horses had kept moving anyway, when every machine in the county stood dead, and she stood there in the dust, and let herself feel it, just for a minute, just for the length of one breath, before she squared her shoulders and turned back to the only thing she'd ever trusted in her life, which was the work. "Come on," she said. "We've still got to get these animals home on their own feet. Mr. Mercer, fetch the gray. Mr. Crowley." And here she looked at the broken man one last time, and there was no cruelty in it, and the lack of cruelty was the worst thing of all. "You can put down the shovel now. You're done. Go home." And Silas Crowley put down the shovel. He put it down, and he walked to his fine sorrel horse through a crowd of his neighbors who would not meet his eye, and he climbed up heavy like an old man, and he rode away from the South Pens, alone in the failing light, while behind him the woman he'd come to ruin gathered her father's horses and started the long walk home. And the whole county watched him go, and not one soul tipped a hat. They got the horses home on their own, 4 feet every one, and Abby slept that night for the first time in 2 years, without dreaming of either grave, and for 11 days after that it seemed almost possible that Caleb Mercer had been right, that the worst was behind her, that the county had turned, and the turning would hold. It held for 11 days. On the 12th, the dust came. But before the dust, there were those 11 days, and Abby would remember them later. The way a person remembers the last good stretch before a hard thing, with a kind of ache, because she hadn't known to hold on to them. Caleb came every one of those days. He didn't make a show of it. He'd ride in at first light with his sleeves already rolled and find some job that needed doing. The barn roof that had wanted patching for 2 summers, the irrigation ditch her father had started and never finished the off-gelding's foot that had been waiting on a man who knew how to pare it right. He didn't ask permission, and he didn't ask pay. The first morning she'd come out and found him already up on the barn with a hammer, and she'd stood in the yard with her hands on her hips and said, "Mr. Mercer, I don't recall hiring you." And he'd looked down at her around a mouthful of nails and said, "No, ma'am, you didn't. I'm cheaper in that. I work for coffee," and gone back to hammering. And that had been the end of the argument, because she'd had no answer for a man who wouldn't fight with her. By the 4th day, the whole county knew the horsebreaker was at the Whitaker place sun up to sundown, and by the 6th day they'd decided what it meant, and Abby caught the looks in town and set her jaw against them. She'd buried a husband. She wasn't a girl to be married off by the gossip of a general store. She told Caleb as much, flat on the 7th evening, standing by the gate while he gathered his tools to ride home. "Folks are talking," she said. "Folks always talk. They're talking about you and me." Caleb set down his tools. He took his time about it. Then he straightened up and looked at her in the long light, and he said, "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm 34 years old, and I broke my first horse at 11, and I have never once in my life done a thing because folks talked nor stopped doing a thing on account of it neither. I come out here 'cause there's work that needs doing, and a woman doing it alone who oughtn't have to. If that troubles you, say so plain, and I'll go and not come back. But don't send me off on account of what's being said in the store by people who laughed at you all summer. That ain't worthy of you." He picked his tools back up. "Does it trouble you?" And Abby, who had braced herself to send him off, found that she could not make the words come, because the truth was, it did not trouble her. The truth was that it was the first thing in 2 years that had felt like the world setting itself right side up, and the not being able to say so frightened her worse than any gossip. "No," she said finally. "It don't trouble me." "Then I'll see you at first light. Caleb said, and rode home, and Abby stood at the gate longer than she meant to, watching the road after he was gone from it. That was the 7th day. On the 8th, Marshal Reed rode up from the county seat, and the news he brought was the first crack in those 11 good days, though Abby didn't see it for what it was at the time. "I looked at the paper," Reed said. He'd taken his hat off sitting his horse in her yard, and he turned it in his hands the way a man does when he's bringing news he's not sure how to give. "At the bank. 11 families, like I said, maybe 12 every note run through Crowley sooner or later. It's there, Mrs. Whitaker. Plain as day, once you know to look. He's been doing exactly what we figured for years." "Then you can stop him." The marshal's face was troubled. "That's the thing. It ain't against the law to buy a man's note. It ain't against the law to rent him a machine, nor raise the rent, nor foreclose when he can't pay. Every single thing Silas Crowley done, he done legal. That's the devil of it. He didn't break no law. He just found where the law's got no fence and drove his whole herd through the gap." He put his hat back on. "I can tell folks what he done. I've been telling 'em. The county knows now, and that's worth something. A man can't operate the same once folks see him clear. But your note, ma'am, your note's good. He holds it fair. And come fall if you're behind the laws on his side, not yours. I'm sorry. I'd give a year's pay to tell you different." Abby took it standing the way she took everything. "How long?" "You're 3 months behind. He can move on it the 1st of October if you ain't caught up." Reed hesitated. "That's 9 weeks, Mrs. Whitaker, and it's $140 to clear it with what he's piled on in interest. I won't lie to you. I don't know where a soul makes $140 in 9 weeks in a drought year." "I'll make it," Abby said. "Ma'am, I'll make it, Marshal. Thank you for riding out." And she turned and went back to her work, because there was nothing else to do with a thing like that but turn and go back to the work. And Reed watched her go, and shook his head, and rode away. And that was the 8th day. She told Caleb that evening. She hadn't meant to, but he saw it on her the way he saw most things, and he set down his tools and waited. And it came out of her, the 9 weeks and the $140 and the legal devil of it, all of it. Caleb listened the way he listened without trying to fix it until she was done. $140, he said, with interest, by the 1st of October. He was quiet a moment. "I've got near 60 saved." "No. I didn't offer it yet." "You don't have to offer it. The answer's no." She rounded on him, and there was a heat in it that surprised them both. "I'll not take your money, Caleb Mercer. I'll not take charity from any man, least of all, a man the county's already got me married off to in their gossip. I take your $60, and what am I? Then I'm the widow that the horsebreaker bought out of trouble. No, no, I'd lose the land first. I mean it. It ain't charity if—" "It's charity," she said. "It's the kindest thing in the world, and it'd kill something in me to take it, and you know it. You of all people know it because you'd no more take a thing you hadn't earned than I would. It's the whole reason you won't take pay for the barn roof." She stopped breathing hard. "Don't ask me again. Please. I can stand most anything, but I can't stand being the project everybody's saving. I've been on my own feet my whole life. Let me stand on 'em." Caleb looked at her a long moment. Then he nodded slow. "All right," he said. "All right, ma'am. I won't ask again. But I'll say this one time and then leave it. There's a difference between charity and neighborin', and the line between 'em is whether a body could ever pay it back. You want to keep it neighborin'? You find a way to pay it back, and I'll find a way to lend it that lets you, and we'll both keep our pride and your land both. But you don't get to call every helpin' hand charity just 'cause takin' it scares you. That ain't pride, ma'am. That's just fear wearin' pride's coat." He picked up his tools. "I'll see you at first light." And he left her with that, and it stung because it was true, and the worst stings always are. That was the 8th day. The 9th and 10th she spent figuring, sitting up late with her father's journals and a stub of pencil, working out what 12 horses could earn in 9 weeks of a drought. Every field that still needed a pass. Every freight haul the broken-down machine teams couldn't make, and she made it come to $140 only if nothing went wrong. Only if every horse stayed sound and every job paid and the weather held. And she knew as well as anyone that in a drought year, nothing ever went the way you figured. On the 11th day, she took 6 horses out before dawn to start earning it, and the work went well, and she came home tired and almost hopeful, and that night the wind came up out of the southwest. She knew the sound of it before she was fully awake. Every plains-born soul knew that sound. The long, low, rising moan of a wind, with no rain in it. The wind that picks up the whole dry skin of the earth and carries it. And she was out of bed and pulling on her boots before she'd thought a single clear thought. And the first clear thought when it came was the horses. And the second was the barn. And the third, unbidden, unwanted, was a man asleep 8 miles off who'd be riding into this at first light if she didn't stop him. She got the horses in. All 12 into the barn in the dark, the wind rising the whole time, and she'd just thrown the last bolt when she heard a horse coming hard up the road, and her heart climbed into her throat because she knew already, she knew before she got the door open, that it was him. It wasn't him. It was the Hatcher boy again, the same boy on a different pony, and he came off it half falling in the rising wind and grabbed her arm. "Mrs. Whitaker!" "Mrs. Whitaker, you got to come. It's Crowley. It's his herd, the big herd. He moved 'em down to the Mill Creek bottom for the grass, and now the storm's come up and they're trapped. They're trapped against the dry crick with the dust comin', and his pumps broke again, and his men can't move 'em, and there's 100 head gonna smother or stampede, and he sent me himself to fetch you. He sent you." Abby stood in the wind with the boy's hands on her arm and felt the whole world go very still and very cold inside the roar of it. "Silas Crowley sent you, to fetch me, after what he said in front of the county. He's near crying, ma'am. I never seen him like it. He said your name, he said fetch the Whitaker woman, she's the only, and then he couldn't hardly say the rest. Please, ma'am, there's men down there too. Caleb Mercer's already rode for it. He was at the store when word come, and he lit out, but he can't move a herd alone, nobody can. Caleb's down there." The cold went straight through her now. "In this, already. Rode out 10 minutes ago, ma'am, and that decided it." Though Abby would tell herself later that the cattle decided it, or the men, or the plain Christian impossibility of letting living things smother in the dark. But the truth she held in her own heart and told no one. Was that the thing that put her back in the barn, pulling harness off the wall with shaking hands, was a horsebreaker 8 miles off, riding alone into a storm that could kill him, and the sudden unbearable knowledge that she could not stand in this world if it took him too. "Saddle up," she told the boy. "You're not riding back into that alone. You'll ride with me as far as the Bell place, and then you'll stop there and you'll stay, you hear? I'll not have a child in that bottom tonight. Go on, move." She harnessed the horses by feel in the dark. 6 of them, the strongest 6, the gray and the bay, and the Duke and the Pilot and Samson and the big black mare. Her father had loved best, and she tied a lantern to her own saddle and wrapped her father's journal in oilcloth and put it inside her coat against her heart, the way she always did when the work was bad, because it was the closest thing she had left to him, riding beside her. And then she led the horses out into the rising wind and the first stinging edge of the dust, and she did not let herself think about whether she'd bring them home this time. She'd learned that much. You didn't think about it. You did the work, and you let the thinking come after, if there was an after. The ride down was the worst of her life, and she'd had some bad ones. The dust came on full before she was halfway, and the wind tore at her, and she rode by memory and by the feel of the road under the horse's feet, and she dropped the boy at the Bell place screaming at him through the wind to stay, bolt the door, and Martha Bell's white face in the doorway, and then she was gone again, on alone into it. She heard the herd before she saw anything. You heard a herd in trouble the way you heard a wind with no rain, a sound that got into your chest and squeezed the bawling of 100 panicked animals, packed against a dry creek bank with nowhere to go, and the dust closing over them, and under it fainter the shouts of men who'd lost control of a thing that could not be controlled by shouting. And then a shape came at her out of the murk, a rider, and her heart stopped and started again when she saw it was him. "Abby?" Caleb hauled his horse around alongside hers. He had a wet bandana over his face, and his eyes were red-rimmed and wild with it, and she had never in her life been so glad to see a living soul. "Abby, you came. God, you came. I prayed you'd have better sense, and I prayed you'd come, and I didn't know which to pray harder. Where's the herd? Bottled against the crick bank, 100 head, maybe more, and they're fixin' to break. When they break, they'll go up the only way that's open, and that's the cut by the freight road, and it's 6 foot deep in dust. They'll go in there and pile up and smother by the score. I seen it happen. I seen a herd smother in a cut." His voice cracked. "Crowley's men are useless. They're just hollerin', making it worse, and Crowley himself's down there on foot like a crazy man trying to turn 'em with his hat." "Then we don't let 'em break," Abby said. "We turn 'em before they break. We open 'em a way out that ain't the cut. There ain't another way out. The crick bank's too steep. There's the old ford." Abby was already moving, already reading it, the whole terrible problem at once, and from the bottom up, the way her father taught her. "The old Mill Creek ford upstream, where the banks broke down. My daddy used to cross stock there. It's dry now, but the bank's low enough to drive 'em up if we can swing the leaders toward it. We swing the leaders, the herd follows the leaders. We just got to turn the front of it, and the rest'll come. Horses can do what men on foot can't. We put the teams on the up creek side, and we push the leaders toward that ford, and we pray the dust don't turn 'em back. That's 100 head of panicked cattle, Abby, if they turn on the horses. Then they turn on the horses, and we get clear, and we lose 'em," Abby said. "But we don't lose 'em standin' here talkin', Caleb." She reached through the dust and the wind and got a fistful of his coat and pulled him close enough to see his eyes. "I need you at the head of the gray. You're the only other hand here that can do this, and I can't be at the leaders and the lines both. Same as you said to me that first mornin'. You remember?" "I remember. I won't lie to you. It's bad. Somebody could go down tonight, and it could be a horse, and it could be you, and it could be me. So I'm askin', not tellin'. You don't have to ride into that herd with me." And Caleb Mercer, with the dust closing over them both, and 100 head of death bawling 40 yards off, looked at her and said the thing she would hold in her heart for the rest of her life. "Ma'am, I'd ride into a sight worse than that beside you, and you know it. And I reckon this ain't the night to make you say why. Put me at the Gray's Head. Let's go open that ford." They went. What they did in that bottom over the next 2 hours, no one who wasn't in it would ever rightly believe, and the few who were in it would never rightly be able to tell it, because there are no words for the kind of work that gets done in a killing dark, when living things are about to die, and only your own 2 hands and a good horse stand between them and it. Abby drove the teams and Caleb worked the leaders, and between them by lantern light that showed barely 6 feet by feel and by prayer, and by 20 years of a dead man's knowledge living on in his daughter's hands, they put 6 horses between 100 panicked cattle and the killing cut, and they pushed, and they turned, and they swung the leaders of the herd a foot at a time toward a ford that none of those cattle could see, and only Abby knew was there. Twice the herd nearly broke and went for the cut anyway, and twice she stopped it, throwing the teams across the front of it, the gray and the black mare rearing and plunging and holding, while the cattle boiled and surged, and finally turned. She lost the lantern in the first hour, knocked from her saddle, and they worked the rest of it in the dark by the feel of the wind and the lay of the ground. Crowley's men shamed into use by the sight of a woman doing what they couldn't got down off their useless panic, and started working the flanks the way she screamed at them to. And somewhere in the dark, Silas Crowley himself on foot, hatless, his fine coat gone, took hold of a horse's bridle when Abby couldn't reach it, and held the animal steady through a surge that would have broken it loose, and did one more useful thing in his life, and it was working. The leaders found the ford. The herd began to pour up and out of the bottom, the only safe way there was, away from the cut, away from the smothering dark. And Abby felt it turn under her hands, the way she'd felt the county turn at the pens. And she let herself for one breath believe they'd done it. And that was when the big black mare went down. She went down in the traces in the dark. The mare her father had loved best dropped to her knees, and then her side with a sound that cut through the whole roar of the storm and the herd, and Abby was off her own horse and into the dust before she'd thought, screaming, "Whoa, whoa!" hauling the team to a stop, with the herd still pouring past, and the cut still open, and 100 head still half mad behind her, and she got down in the dirt in the dark, with her father's favorite horse, and put her hands on her, and felt the heaving sides and the exhaustion that had finally been too much. And she understood in one breath that if she stopped the whole rescue here to save one foundered horse, the herd might turn, might break, might go for the cut, and she could lose the 100 to save the one. And she did not hesitate. "Caleb," she screamed into the dark. "Hold 'em off her! Hold the team, we're stoppin'! Hold!" Abby, the herd. Let the herd go where it goes. We're savin' the mare. And out of the dust, into the lantern light that wasn't there anymore, came Silas Crowley on foot, his face a horror, and he grabbed her arm where she knelt in the dirt over the downed horse, and he screamed at her over the wind. "What are you doin'? What are you doin'? That's one horse, and there's 100 head of cattle. You stop now, and they break for the cut, and I lose everything. Get up, get up. That's $1,000 of cattle, and that's one broke-down old mare." And Abby Whitaker, on her knees in the dirt with her dead father's favorite horse, heaving her last under her hands, looked up at Silas Crowley and said the thing the whole county would repeat for a generation. "Then you lose it. You lose every head. I will not trade a living thing's life for your profit. Not tonight. Not ever. That's the whole difference between us, Silas, and it always has been. It's a horse." And then there was another voice in the dark, and a hand that closed on Silas Crowley's shoulder and tore him bodily back off Abby, and it was Caleb who had thrown the lines to one of Crowley's own men and come for them. And he put himself between Silas and the woman in the dirt, and he was not quiet. Now he was not careful. Now his voice came out of him like something that had been waiting 2 years to be said. "That horse," Caleb said, and the wind couldn't bury it, "has done more for this town in one summer than you done in your whole life, Silas Crowley. That horse hauled water to your dyin' cattle. That horse is layin' here foundered, 'cause it spent its heart savin' your herd not 3 weeks past, and now you stand over it screamin' about profit, while the woman who saved your sorry hide twice over tries to save its life. You want to talk about what's worth what? That broke-down old mare is worth 10 of you. Now get back and tend your cattle and leave her be, or so help me God. I'll lay you in the dirt beside her and let the herd sort us both out." Silas Crowley stood in the storm and the dark, his mouth working, and something happened in his face that no one would have believed of him, because for the first time in his life, Silas Crowley was looking at himself, was seeing himself the way the dark and the dust and the dying horse and the 2 people on their knees in the dirt showed him to himself. And it was not a thing a man could see and stay the same. He got back. He turned and stumbled back toward his cattle in the dark, and he tended them, and the herd poured up out of the bottom through the ford and did not break for the cut. After all, saved by the men working the flanks, and by the leaders. Abby had already turned before the mare went down, so that in the end, her stopping cost nothing. The 100 head and the 1 horse both came through, but Crowley didn't know that yet. And Abby didn't know it yet, kneeling in the dirt. In the moment that mattered, the moment Crowley screamed and Caleb tore him off her. Neither of them knew the herd would make it, and Abby chose the horse anyway. And that was the whole of who she was, laid bare in the dark, for any soul to see. The mare didn't die. Abby got her up. It took an hour, and it took everything Abby and Caleb both had left working over her in the dying wind, as the dust thinned, and the worst of it blew through, cooling her, walking her. Talking to her low and steady, the way you talk to something you love when you've got nothing left to give it but your voice, and the old black mare, her father's favorite. The horse he'd raised from a foal and called the best heart he ever bred, hauled herself up out of the dirt on legs that shook and stood swaying alive, and put her nose against Abby's chest, where her father's journal lay wrapped against her heart. And Abby Whitaker, who had not wept at her husband's grave, nor her father's, who had taken everything standing all summer long, put her arms around the old mare's neck in the thinning dark, and broke at last, and wept like the world was ending. And Caleb Mercer stood close beside her with his hat in his hands, and let her, and did not try to fix it. And that was the truest kindness he ever did her. By the time the wind died altogether, and the first gray showed in the east, it was over. 112 head of Silas Crowley's cattle stood blown and trembling but alive on the high ground above the Mill Creek bottom, turned from the killing cut by 6 horses and 2 people, and every soul who'd been in that bottom that night, Crowley's hired men, and the few from town who'd come, stood looking at the sunburned widow, with her arm still around the neck of a horse she'd refused to let die. And there was not a man among them who would ever again, as long as he lived, say one word against the Whitaker place, or the 12 horses, or the woman who kept them. Silas Crowley came to her one more time before the morning. He came on foot slow, an old man's walk, though he wasn't old, and he stopped a few feet off, and he took off what was left of his hat, and for a long moment he couldn't find any words at all. When they came rough like something dug up. "You saved 'em," he said. "Again. After what you stopped for that horse, and you saved him anyway, and I stood there and screamed at you over a—" He stopped. His face worked. "I've been wrong about you. I've been wrong about a great many things. I don't know how to—" And then the proud, meanest man in Red Hollow, who had threatened in front of the whole county to take everything she had, stood in the gray morning light and could not finish, and what he could not say hung in the air between them heavier than anything he'd ever said out loud. Abby looked at him over the neck of her father's horse. She was too tired for hate, and too honest for false comfort, and what she gave him was the plain truth, which was the only thing she'd ever had to give anyone. "I know you have," she said. "Wrong about me, and worse than wrong about a lot of folks before me. The Hendrys, the Pruitts, 11 families Silas. I can't fix that for you, and I won't pretend it's fixed, but I'll tell you what my daddy told me." She held his eyes. "A machine stops when the world gets hard. A good horse keeps going when somebody's earned its trust. You spent your whole life buying machines, Silas, and renting 'em out to break folks, and you never once in all those years earned a single living thing's trust. And now you're standing in the dirt at dawn watching a foundered old mare you wanted dead stand up on her own 4 feet because somebody loved her enough to stop. You think on that. You think on it good. 'Cause that's the whole of what you missed." And she turned away from him and put her face against the mare's neck, and Silas Crowley stood alone in the gray light with the word she'd given him, and after a while he put his ruined hat back on his head and walked away to his cattle. A different man than the one who'd ridden down into that bottom, though it would be a while yet before anyone himself most of all understood how different. Caleb brought her horse around. Dawn was full now, the storm blown through the air washed clean. Abby straightened up, wiped her face with the back of a filthy hand, and looked at the 6 horses, every one of them standing, every one of them alive. The black mare among them swaying but sound. "Let's go home," she said. "All of us. Every one." Her voice broke on it, and she let it. "We're all going home." Caleb put his hand over hers on the mare's lead. Just for a moment. The first time he'd touched her, and neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying, and then he helped her up onto her horse, and they gathered the teams and turned them north toward home, in the clean light of the morning, after the woman and the man and the 6 horses that had turned 100 head of cattle from death in the dark, riding home, slow up the road, where the whole county would soon be standing to watch them come. The county was standing on the road to watch them come, just as she'd known it would be, but it was not the watching she'd braced herself for, and that was the first thing that undid her. She'd ridden up that road all summer under eyes that laughed. She'd learned to carry herself stiff against it to keep her chin level and her hands soft on the lines and to give them nothing. And she came up the road now out of the Mill Creek bottom, expecting more of the same ready for it armored against it. And instead, as the first wagons came into sight, and then the first knots of people standing along the rails and at the crossroads, every man among them took off his hat. They took off their hats, and they did not say anything, and somehow the not saying anything was louder than any cheer could have been. Old Tom Avery, who'd called her a fool to her face at the general store in June, stood at his gate with his hat against his chest and his head bowed as she passed like a man at a graveside. The Pruitt boy, whose family Crowley had broken and sold up 2 years gone, stood in the road and watched the horses go by with his jaw working. Women came out onto their porches. Children were hushed. and the 6 horses walked up through it, slow and blown and proud, the black mare swaying but sound. And Abby Whitaker rode up through her own county, under the bared heads of every soul who'd mocked her, and she could not keep her chin level after all. She had to look at her hands. "Steady," Caleb said quietly beside her. "Steady, ma'am. You earned every hat on that road. Let 'em give it to you." "I don't want it," she said low, fierce through a closing throat. "I never wanted it. I just wanted to keep my daddy's horses and be left alone." "I know it." He rode close. "That's exactly why you earned it. The ones who want it never do." Martha Bell was waiting at her gate when they finally reached the Whitaker place, and she'd been crying since before they came into sight, and she didn't stop. She came out into the road with her apron full of something, and her old face wet, and she walked alongside Abby's horse, with her hand on Abby's boot, the whole last stretch to the barn, saying her name over and over. "Abby, Abby, child, you're alive. You brought 'em all home. Look at you, look at you." And when they got to the barn, she pressed the apron load on her eggs, and a fresh loaf still warm, and a little crock of butter. Everything the old widow had in her house, and Abby tried to refuse it, the way she refused everything, and Martha Bell would not be refused. "You'll take it," Martha said, "and you'll not say one word about charity to me, Abby Whitaker, not one after the night you've had. This ain't charity. This is a old woman with nothing else to give trying to say a thing she ain't got the words for. You take my eggs, and you let me say it." And Abby took the eggs, and the 2 widows stood in the barn doorway and held on to each other while the horses were seen to. And that was the second thing that undid her, because she had spent 2 years believing she was alone, and she was learning against her will, against everything the graves had taught her, that she was not. The horses came first. They always came first. Abby would not sleep nor eat nor sit until every one of the 6 was rubbed down and watered and grained, and the black mare's legs were poulticed and wrapped, and Caleb worked beside her through all of it without a word about rest, because he knew the way he knew most things about her, now that she could not stop until they were tended, that stopping before they were tended was a thing that simply was not in her. It was full morning before the last wrap was tied, and the mare stood dozing in deep straw sound alive, and only then did Abby let herself lean against the stall door and feel how close she was to falling down. "Now you," Caleb said, "now you eat something and you sleep, or I'll carry you to the house myself, and damn what the county says about it." She almost smiled. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me, ma'am. I've had a long night and I'm short on manners." And she did eat a little Martha Bell's bread and 1 egg, and she did sleep, and she slept the whole day through and into the night. And while she slept, the county did a thing that when she woke to find it done, brought her closer to breaking than the storm had. She woke to the sound of hammering. She came out into the yard in the late light, stiff and aching in every joint, and there were a dozen men in her yard. Tom Avery was up on the barn roof finishing the patch Caleb had started. The Pruitt boy and 2 others were down in the irrigation ditch with shovels, the ditch her father had started and never finished throwing dirt, opening it the last 40 yards to the creek. Somebody had mended the corral gate that had hung crooked for a year. Somebody had stacked a cord of wood by the kitchen door, and it kept coming all evening, wagons rolling in with a sack of grain, a side of bacon, a coil of new rope, a keg of nails. Men who'd laughed at her in June, coming up the road now with their hats in their hands and a thing in their wagon beds, and not knowing how to say what they'd come to say, so saying it with the thing instead. Abby stood on her own porch and watched her yard fill up with the work of the men who'd mocked her, and she could not speak. Caleb came and stood beside her. "I didn't ask for this," she said. Her voice wasn't steady. "Caleb, I didn't ask a one of 'em." "No," he said. "You didn't. That's the whole point of it, ma'am. A body that asks gets given to out of guilt, and it shames 'em both. A body that never asks and gets given to anyway." He stopped. "That's something else. That's a county trying to make right a wrong it's ashamed of. You let 'em. It's as much for them as it is for you, maybe more. A man's got to do something with his shame or it rots him. You're giving him a place to put it down." Tom Avery came down off the barn roof and crossed the yard to the porch, turning his hat in his hands, an old man who'd been hard all his life and didn't know how to be soft. And he stood at the bottom of the steps and looked up at her and couldn't quite get there, and finally he just said gruff, "Roof's done. Won't leak now. Should have been done 2 summers back. I'd have—" He stopped, started again. "Your daddy fixed my well one winter when I was down with the lung fever. 46 it was. Did it for nothing. I forgot it. I'm ashamed to say I forgot it till I stood up on your roof just now and remembered. He was a better neighbor to me than I ever was to his girl. I'm sorry for it, Mrs. Whitaker. That's all. I'm just sorry." And he put his hat on and walked back to his wagon before she could answer, which was a mercy because she had no answer, because her throat had closed entirely. And she stood on her porch in the falling light and watched a hard old man carry his shame back to his wagon and drive away, having finally set it down. And she understood what Caleb meant, and she let them. She let them all. It was the hardest thing she'd done all summer, harder than the pens, and harder than the storm to stand still and be given to. But she did it because she finally understood it wasn't only hers to refuse. But the note still hung over all of it. 9 weeks had become 7. $140 had not become any smaller. And no amount of bread and bacon and mended gates would clear a debt at the bank, and Abby knew it, and the knowing of it sat under every kindness, like a stone under still water. It was 3 days later that the marshal rode out again, and this time the news he brought changed everything, though not in the way anyone could have guessed. Reed came at mid-morning, and he sat his horse in the yard, and he didn't take his hat off this time. He left it on, official, and his honest face was grave, in a way that put a cold finger on Abby's spine before he said a word. "Mrs. Whitaker, is Mercer about?" "He's in the barn. Why?" "Fetch him if you would. This concerns him some, too." She fetched him. Caleb came out wiping his hands, and the 3 of them stood in the yard, and Marshal Reed looked at the 2 of them a long moment, and then he said, "Silas Crowley come to see me, yesterday. Rode all the way up to the county seat to find me." He paused. "He's filed papers." The bottom dropped out of Abby's stomach. "Papers. On your note." Reed watched her face. "He's filed on your note, Mrs. Whitaker." And there it was. The thing she'd known was coming. The thing the storm and the saved herd and the changed man at dawn had let her foolishly believe might not come after all. And she felt the 7 good days and the mended roof and Martha Bell's eggs all turn to ash in her chest. Because of course, a man didn't change in one night in a storm. Of course it had been a lie. Of course Silas Crowley had taken her saving his herd a second time, and her words to him at dawn and her father's wisdom, and used the time she'd bought him to file his papers and finish the thing he'd started. And she stood in her yard and felt the old cold certainty close back over her, that she was a fool to have hoped that hope was a thing the graves had taken for good reason. "He's filed to forgive it," Reed said. The word didn't make sense. She heard it, and it didn't make sense. What? To forgive it? The note. He's filed papers releasing it in full, clear with the bank as witness made out. So there's no taking it back, no quiet reversal, no liens, nothing. It's done legal, and it's done permanent, and it's done public on the county record where the whole world can see it. Reed reached into his coat and brought out a folded paper and held it out to her. And his honest face had something working in it that she'd never seen there before, something like wonder. "Eli Whitaker's note is cleared, Mrs. Whitaker. You don't owe Silas Crowley 1 red cent. You don't owe the bank. You don't owe anybody. The land's yours free and clear the way your daddy meant it to be." Abby took the paper. She didn't read it. She couldn't, her eyes wouldn't hold the words. She stood in her yard and held a piece of paper that meant her father's land was hers, and tried to understand it, and could not. And Caleb had gone very still beside her, and Martha Bell, who'd come out to see what the marshal wanted, made a small sound and pressed both hands to her mouth. "That ain't all," Reed said, and his voice had changed again, gone careful, gone slow. "Silas filed something else, too. The same day. He's been busy." He looked at the Pruitt boy, who'd come up from the ditch to listen, and at the others gathering the way people gather when the law's in the yard. "He filed to release the others." The notes he held on the broke families, the Hendrys, what's left of 'em, the Larkins, the Mill Creek bottom places. Every note Silas Crowley held on a ruined family in this county, he's releasing all of 'em. And where the family's gone and can't be found, he's deeding the land to the county to be held for 'em or their kin. He's giving it back, all of it. Everything he took. The yard had gone dead silent. The Pruitt boy had gone white. "Why?" Abby said. It came out of her barely above a whisper. "Why would he?" "I asked him that," Reed said. "I asked him straight out. A man don't give away a fortune for nothin'. I figured there was a angle. I've been waitin' 6 years for the angle." He shook his head slow. "There wasn't no angle. You know what he told me? He said—" Reed stopped, and his voice wasn't quite steady either now. "He said he stood in the dark in that bottom and watched a woman get down in the dirt to save one broke-down old horse with 100 head of his cattle about to break, and he screamed at her that the horse wasn't worth it, and she looked up at him and told him she'd lose every head before she'd trade a livin' thing's life for his profit. And he said he'd spent his whole life believin' the opposite of that every single day and gotten rich on it, and it wasn't till he stood there in the dark that he saw what it had made him. He said—" Reed's throat worked. "He said you told him a machine stops when the world gets hard, but a good horse keeps going when somebody's earned its trust, and that he'd never in his life earned the trust of one livin' thing. And he was 45 years old, and he aimed to spend whatever he had left trying to before he died, and the only way he knew to start was to give back every dishonest dollar he'd ever made." Abby stood in her yard with the paper in her hands and could not speak. "He's selling out," Reed went on quietly. "The cattle, the machines, the rented equipment, all of it. Keepin' the one ranch he came by honest years ago, and not a thing more. Says he's done bein' the richest man in the county. Says it never bought him a single thing worth havin'." The marshal put the folded copy back in his coat. "I've been the law in this county 6 years, Mrs. Whitaker, and I've seen men hang, and I've seen men run, and I've seen men lie their way clear, but I never once seen a man do what Silas Crowley done this week. I don't rightly know what to make of it, except," he looked at her, "except I reckon you do. I reckon you knew something the rest of us didn't all summer long behind them horses." And then he tipped his hat and rode away and left her standing in the yard. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the Pruitt boy made a sound, a young man's broken sound, and turned away with his hand over his face, because his family's land was coming back, the land they'd lost. The land his father had died grieving for in a rented room in another town. And Martha Bell went to him and put her arms around him, and the yard came alive with the low, astonished murmur of people trying to take in a thing too big to take in. Abby didn't move. She stood holding the paper. Caleb came and stood in front of her, and he didn't touch her. He just stood close, and he said very quietly, just for her, "You did that. You understand me, ma'am. You didn't ask for it, and you didn't aim for it, and you'd undo it this minute if it'd give you back a quiet summer. But you did it. You changed that man. Not with the herd you saved, with the horse you stopped for. He watched you choose a foundered old mare over a fortune in cattle, and it broke something open in him that's been shut his whole life. 11 families are getting their land back, Abby, because you couldn't let one horse die in the dark." His voice had gone rough. Your daddy spent 20 years trying to teach this county a thing it wouldn't learn, and it laughed at him, and he died thinking he'd failed, thinking it was all for nothing. And you taught it to the worst man in it in one night. He didn't fail, ma'am. He just had to wait for you to finish it. And that was the thing that finally broke her. All the way, that did what the storm and the hats and the eggs and the mended roof couldn't quite do, because she had carried it for 2 years, the worst of all of it. The thing she'd never said to a living soul that her father had died, believing he'd wasted his whole life on horses. Nobody wanted that. The last clear thing he'd said to her before his worn-out heart gave out was that he was sorry. He was sorry he had nothing to leave her but a string of useless animals, and a notebook full of a dead way of doing things, that he'd failed her, that she'd have been better off if he'd sold out to the steam men years before, like everyone told him to. She had held his head in her lap and heard him apologize for the only inheritance worth having, and she had never been able to tell him different, and he had died believing it, and she had carried that for 2 years, like a stone where her heart should be. And now Caleb Mercer stood in her yard and told her that her father hadn't failed, that the thing he'd died believing was a lie, that his life's work had reached down into the worst soul in the county and turned it inside out, and that she had been the hand that did it. She put her face in her ruined hands, and she wept standing up in front of the whole gathered yard. And this time it wasn't grief, and it wasn't even joy. It was something with no name, the great unbearable releasing of a thing carried too long and too alone. And Caleb Mercer stepped in close and let her lean against him, his hat in one hand and the other arm around her shoulders, holding her up in front of the whole county. And nobody laughed, and nobody looked away. And Martha Bell wept, and the Pruitt boy wept, and Tom Avery took off his hat again and held it against his chest, and the whole yard stood witness to the widow weeping in the horsebreaker's arms in the late summer light, and there was not one soul among them who did not understand that they were watching something holy. When she could speak again, she pulled back and wiped her face and looked up at Caleb, and there was a thing in her face he hadn't seen there before, a thing the graves had buried and the storm had dug back up. "He apologized to me," she said. "My daddy, before he died, for the horses, for leaving me nothing but the horses." Her voice cracked. "I never could tell him. I never got to tell him they weren't nothing, that they were everything, that he didn't fail me." She gripped Caleb's arm. "He didn't fail me, Caleb." "No, ma'am," Caleb said. "He surely didn't. They were everything. They were." She nodded and breathed and stood up out of his arm onto her own 2 feet, the way she always did, the way she always would, but she did it slower this time, and she didn't move all the way away, and that meant something, and they both knew it meant something. Silas Crowley came one last time near sundown, when the yard had emptied of all but Caleb and Martha Bell. He came on a plain horse, no fine sorrel now, in plain clothes, and he stopped at the gate and didn't come through it, and Abby walked down to meet him there, and they stood on either side of her father's fence in the last light. "You heard, I expect," Silas said. He couldn't look at her straight. "From Reed." "I heard. It ain't enough. I know it ain't enough. You can't give a man back the years, nor the grave the Pruitts dug for a father who died of it, nor—" He stopped. "I know it ain't enough, but it's what I've got to give, so I'm giving it." "Why are you telling me?" Abby said. "You didn't have to come tell me. Because—" And here the proud man's voice failed him, and he had to start again. "Because you're the one that did it, and I reckoned you ought to hear it from me. Not the marshal, that the thing you said to me in the dark about earnin' a livin' thing's trust. I been awake 3 nights with it. I never earned a thing in my life I couldn't buy. And I looked at what I'd built, and I saw it was all machines, rented machines. Things that stop when the world gets hard, and not one living thing among 'em that'd cross the road for me if I was dyin'." He finally looked at her. "You got 12 horses that'd walk into a storm for you, and a whole county that took off its hat today, and you got it all by being the one thing I never was, which is somebody worth trustin'. I wanted you to know I finally seen it. That's all. I'll not trouble you again." He started to turn his horse. "Silas," he stopped. "It's a start," Abby said. "What you done? It ain't enough, and you're right that it ain't, and some of them families won't ever forgive you, and they oughtn't have to. But it's a start, and a start's more than most men ever make, and my daddy'd have told you the same. So you go earn that trust you're after. One living thing at a time. It's slow, and it don't ever come quick, and you can't buy a minute of it." A pause. "But it can be done. I've seen it done. Took my father 20 years, and it was the richest thing he ever owned. Go on and start. You've got time." And Silas Crowley sat his plain horse at her father's fence and looked at her for a long moment, and then he did a thing he had never once done to any soul in Red Hollow in 20 years of living there. He took off his hat to a person he could not buy, and he bowed his head, and he said, "Thank you, ma'am." And he meant it all the way down, and then he rode away into the last of the light. A poorer man, and a better one. And Abby Whittaker stood at her father's fence and watched him go. And behind her in the barn, her 12 horses moved soft in the straw sound and fed and home. And the land they stood on was hers now, free and clear, the way her father had always meant it to be. The next spring came green to Red Hollow, the first soft spring after the killing summer, and Abby Whitaker woke one March morning to the sound she'd waited her whole life to hear, without ever once letting herself believe it would come, the sound of her own land being worked the way her father had meant it to be worked. It was the Pruitt boy out before her harnessing the gray. She came out onto the porch and watched him for a minute before he knew she was there. This boy whose family Crowley had broken, who had his land back now, and a father's grave to tend, and a thing in him that had been bent nearly to snapping, and was slowly straightening. And he was talking to the gray, the way she'd taught him to over the winter low, and even watering the horse before himself out of the bucket he'd carried out. And Abby stood on her porch and watched a thing her father had spent 20 years trying to plant take root in a boy who hadn't even been grown when the old man died, and she had to hold the porch rail. "He's getting good," Caleb said, coming around from the barn. He'd taken to coming earlier and earlier through the winter until there wasn't rightly a morning. He wasn't there before light, and the county had long since stopped talking about it, the way a county stops talking about a thing once it's decided the thing is right. That boy, 2 months ago he couldn't put a collar on straight. Now look at him. Hands like his granddaddy might have had if Crowley hadn't took the ground before the boy was old enough to learn on it. "My daddy would have liked him," Abby said. "Your daddy would have liked all of it." And that was the truth, because the Whitaker place was not what it had been a year before. Through the fall and the long winter, the thing that had started in the storm and the giving back had gone on growing slow and certain. The way the things that last always grow, and it had grown into this. A place where the poor families of Red Hollow, the ones still finding their feet after Crowley, the ones who'd sold their teams for steam and lost both, came to learn the old way. Again came to borrow a team for a planting they couldn't otherwise make. Came to sit in the evenings while Abby read out of her father's journals in the lamplight and learned what 20 years of patience had taught one man about horses and water and the keeping of living things through hard times. It had not been Abby's idea. She wanted to be clear on that with herself most of all, because she was not a woman who'd ever sought to be looked to. It had been Caleb's idea, and the county's the thing growing up around her, whether she reached for it or not, the way the respect had grown up around her in the pens and on the road, because that was how it went with the ones who never asked. The first to come had been the Larkin widow in October with 2 half-grown sons and a quarter section come back to her off Crowley's giving, and not one animal to work it. She'd stood at Abby's gate the way Abby had once stood stiff against the county's eyes, braced for charity, ready to refuse it, and Abby had seen herself in the woman so clear it stopped her breath, and she'd known exactly what to say because it was the thing she'd needed somebody to say to her. "It ain't charity," Abby had told her. "I'll lend you the Duke and the Pilot for your spring plowin', and in exchange you'll send your boys here 3 days a week through the winter to learn the handlin'. And once they know it, they'll help me teach the next family that comes, and that family'll teach the next. That ain't charity, Mrs. Larkin. That's a debt you pay forward 'stead of back. My daddy never could abide a thing given for nothin'. Said it shamed both ends of it, but a thing passed along." Abby had stopped hearing her father in her own mouth. "A thing passed along keeps everybody's back straight. You understand me?" And the Larkin widow had understood her the way Abby had understood Caleb in her own yard, and she'd sent her boys, and the boys had learned, and now those boys were teaching the Henry girl who'd come in January. And the thing was passing along exactly the way Abby had said it would. Exactly the way her father had always believed a thing worth having ought to pass, and it was the proof of everything he'd died doubting. Growing up green right out of the ground he'd worked. But it had not all been easy. And Abby would not pretend later that it had been because there'd been a hard reckoning in the dead of winter that nearly tore the whole thing down, and it had come of all places from Silas Crowley. He'd kept his word through the fall. He'd sold the cattle and the machines, released the notes, deeded back the land, and gone quiet on his one honest ranch, and the county had watched him the way you watch a snake that claims it's done, biting, waiting. And in December, when the first hard cold came and the Hendry family was near to freezing in a half-finished soddy on the land they'd just got back with no fuel laid by and no time to lay it, Silas Crowley had shown up at their place with 3 wagon loads of cut wood and a side of beef and a stove he'd hauled 40 miles, and he'd unloaded it all himself in the cold. And the Hendrys had stood in their doorway, not knowing whether to thank him or curse him, because this was the man who'd taken their land in the first place. This was the architect of every hard year they'd had. Word of it reached the Whitaker place by nightfall the way all word did, and it split the families who'd gathered there clean down the middle, and Abby found herself in the worst argument of the whole long year in her own barn, with people she'd come to love. "He don't get to buy his way clear," the Pruitt boy had said, and his voice had shaken with it, young and raw. "3 wagons of wood don't bring back my father. He died in a rented room, Mrs. Whitaker grievin' for the ground that man took, and now Crowley rides around playin' the saint, and we're all supposed to—" "He couldn't finish. Nobody's asking you to forgive him," Abby had said. "You forgave him. At your own fence, the marshal said you told him to go earn his trust back. You wished him well. I didn't forgive him." Abby had stood up in the lamplight, and the barn had gone quiet. "Listen to me, all of you, 'cause this matters, and I'll only say it once. I never forgave Silas Crowley. Forgiveness ain't mine to give for what he done to the Pruitts and the Hendrys and the Larkins. That's theirs, and theirs alone. And any one of you that never forgives him to your dyin' day, you're in the right, and I'll stand with you in it." She'd looked at the Pruitt boy. "What I told him at my fence wasn't forgiveness. It was a true thing. I told him a start's more than most men ever make, and he ought to go on and make it. That ain't the same as saying it's finished. It ain't finished. It won't be finished in his life nor yours. A man can spend the rest of his days trying to earn back what he stole and still die owing. That's the justice of it. That's the cost. He took something he can't give back years, and a grave, and the wood don't change that, and the beef don't change that, and he knows it. You want to know how I know he knows it." She'd held the boy's eyes. "Because a man buyin' his way clear does it loud in the daylight where folks can see. Silas hauled that wood 40 miles and unloaded it himself in the cold and didn't tell a soul. That ain't a man buyin' his way clear, son. That's a man payin' on a debt he knows he'll never finish payin' because the payin' is the only thing he's got left worth doin'. You don't have to thank him for it. You don't have to forgive him for it. But don't you stand in my barn and tell me a man can't change, 'cause I watched him change in the dark with my own eyes, and your granddaddy's land is under your boots right now because of it." The barn had been silent a long time, and then the Pruitt boy had sat down slow and put his face in his hands and said muffled broken, "I don't know how to not hate him." And Abby had crossed the barn and knelt down in front of the boy, and taken his hands away from his face, and held them this boy who'd lost what she'd nearly lost, and she'd said soft, "Then don't make yourself. Hatin' him's honest, and you come by it fair. But don't let the hatin' of him eat the rest of you the way the grief near ate me. That's the only thing I'll ask. You hate Silas Crowley all you need to, but you go home tonight to land that's yours again, and you light a fire in a stove. The man who wronged you hauled 40 miles in the cold, and you stay warm, and you live, and you grow something good on that ground. Because the best thing you'll ever do to a man like that ain't hatin' him. It's outliving him into something he could never be. You understand me?" And the Pruitt boy had nodded, and that had been the hard winter reckoning, and the thing had held and held the way the right things hold. And by spring the boy was out before dawn, harnessing the gray, and talking to it low and watering it before himself. And he had not forgiven Silas Crowley, and he did not have to, and he was warm, and he was alive, and he was growing something good on his grandfather's ground. And that was the whole of what Abby had asked. The black mare lived through the winter sound. That was the other thing Abby would hold to the end of her days, that her father's favorite. The old mare that had gone down in the storm that Silas Crowley had screamed wasn't worth one head of cattle, lived through the winter sound, and dropped a foal in the green of that first spring. A black filly with a star, and Abby was there in the straw when it came in the gray before dawn. And she sat back on her heels when the filly found its legs and pushed up wet and trembling, and stood, and she laughed and cried both at once because here was the proof of the last thing. The final thing, the thing that closed the circle her father had opened 20 years before. He'd have named her, Abby said. Caleb was there beside her in the straw, the way he was beside her in everything now. My daddy. He named every foal himself. He had a whole way of it, a name for the line going back to the first stud colt he ever brought out here. Then you name her, Caleb said. You name her in his way. And Abby looked at the black filly with the star, the granddaughter of the horse her father had loved best, born sound on the land that was hers, free and clear on a spring morning, with the whole county learning the old man's ways at last. And she said, Promise. Her name's Promise, because that's what he left me when everybody said he left me nothing. He left me a promise, and I kept it, and here it's standing on its own 4 legs in the straw. Her voice broke, and she let it. That's her name, Promise. It was that spring, too, that Caleb Mercer finally said the thing he'd been not saying since the morning they rode up out of the Mill Creek bottom under the bared heads of the whole county. He'd built her a proper barn over the winter, him and the families together, a real barn, the way her father had always wanted and never could afford. And he'd repaired the irrigation ditch the last 40 yards so the creek ran into her father's fields, the way the old man had drawn it in his journal years before he died. And he'd been there every morning before light, and every evening till dark, and the county had married them in its talk 100 times over, and still he'd never said it, because he was a careful man, and because he knew her, and because he understood that a woman who'd buried a husband and a father inside a single year and learned to stand on her own feet against a whole county was not a woman to be rushed not by gossip and not by him. He said it in the evening by the new barn with the filly Promise nosing at the fence and the old mare watching, and he said it plain the way he said everything. Abby. It was the first time he'd used her Christian name without the storm forcing it. I'm 35 years old now, had my birthday in February. You'll recall, you baked me a thing that didn't rise. A pause, and the corner of his mouth moved, and then went still. I've been coming out here every morning for near a year. I reckon you know why, and I reckon I've waited long enough that saying it plain won't startle you. I love you. I have since the morning you watered that off-horse before yourself at Crowley's fence, though I didn't have the sense to know it was love till the storm when I rode down into that bottom, more afraid of losing you than of dying. He turned his hat in his hands, the old gesture, the careful man making sure of his words. I'm not asking you to need me. You don't need any man, and you never will, and I'd not want you different. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you on your land for whatever's left of both our lives, not because you can't stand alone, but because I'd rather stand next to you than anywhere else there is. That's all. That's the whole of it. You take whatever time you need with it. I've waited a year. I can wait more. And Abby Whitaker, who had stood on her own 2 feet against everything the world could throw, who had buried 2 men and 100 hopes and learned to need nothing. From anyone looked at the one man who had stepped forward when the whole county laughed, the man who'd taken off his hat to her in the dust and ridden into a storm beside her and held her up in front of the county, when she broke, and never once, not one single time, tried to fix her or save her or make her smaller than she was. And she did not make him wait. I don't need you, she said, and her voice was steady and her eyes were not. You're right that I don't, and you're the only man I ever met who'd say it like it was a fine thing stead of a fault. But Caleb Mercer. And here her voice did break all the way, and she let it because she had learned at last that the breaking was not the same as the falling. I have spent 2 years not needin' anybody, and it is the loneliest thing I ever did, and I am done with it. I don't need you, I want you. And I've come to learn that's the better thing of the two, and the rarer, and the one a body ought to hold on to with both hands when the Lord's fool enough to send it twice in one life. So yes, stand beside me. On my daddy's land, for whatever's left. She reached out and took the hat right out of his careful hands. And quit turning your hat. You don't need it between us anymore. They were married in June, a year, almost to the day, from the morning the steam pumps failed, and the only thing moving in all of Red Hollow was a sunburned widow behind 6 horses. They were married in the Whitaker yard, under the bared heads of the whole county, the same county that had laughed, and Martha Bell cried through the whole of it. and the Larkin boys held the horses, and the Pruitt boy stood up beside Caleb as a man grown, and Marshall Reed gave the bride away, because she had no father to do it. And he was the nearest thing to an honest man's blessing the county had to offer, and Silas Crowley came. He came late, and he stood at the very back at the fence in plain clothes, not presuming to come closer, a man who knew he had no right to a place at the front of anything in that county ever again and had stopped wanting one. And when it was done, when the vows were said and the thing was sealed, Abby walked back down through all of them on Caleb's arm, and she saw Silas at the fence alone, and she stopped. The whole yard watched her stop. She crossed to the fence in her wedding clothes, and Silas Crowley took off his hat and bowed his head and started to say something about how he hadn't meant to intrude. He'd only wanted to see it. He'd go. "You'll not go," Abby said. "You'll come up to the house and you'll eat at my table. You hauled wood 40 miles in the cold for the Hendrys and told nobody. You gave back everything you ever stole and kept the hardest road for yourself. You'll not stand at the back of my wedding like a beggar at a gate. You've earned a place at the table, Silas, not at the front. You'll never sit at the front, and you know it, and you've stopped asking to, and that's exactly why you've earned the table. Come and eat." And Silas Crowley, the richest and meanest man Red Hollow had ever known, made poor by his own hand, and made decent by one woman's refusal to trade a living thing's life for his profit, came up to the house and ate at the wedding table of the widow. He'd tried to ruin down at the far end, quiet, grateful earning by the inch the thing he'd never been able to buy, and the county watched him do it and did not stop him, and some of them would never forgive him, and some of them slowly did, and both were right. And that was the justice of it, slow and unfinished and true. That night, when the last wagon had rolled home and the lamps were low, Abby went out to the barn one final time the way she did every night of her life to see the horses settled. Caleb came with her the way he would now every night of both their lives. The 12 stood quiet in the deep straw of the new barn. Her father had always wanted sound and fed and home, and the old black mare dozed with her foal pressed against her flank. The filly, promise born sound on free land and beyond the barn. The irrigation ditch ran soft with creek water into fields her father had drawn on paper years before he died, believing he'd failed. Abby stood in the doorway with her husband's arm around her and looked at all of it. The horses and the foal and the running water and the land that was hers, free and clear. And she thought of her father the way she did every night, and for the first time in 3 years she thought of him without the stone where her heart should be, because the stone was gone, the storm had washed it out, and the spring had grown something over the place where it had been. He didn't fail. She said soft to the dark, to the horses, to the man who'd died apologizing for the only inheritance worth having. "You hear me, Daddy? You didn't fail. They laughed at your horses, and the horses outlived every machine in the county, and they're standing here sound on your land while Silas Crowley's steam pumps rust in a field, and a whole county that mocked you is learning your ways by lamplight, and there's a foal in your straw named Promise. You didn't leave me nothing. You left me everything, and I kept it. I kept all of it." Caleb pulled her close, and they stood together in the doorway of the barn a long while not talking, because there wasn't anything that needed saying, and the horses moved soft in the straw, and the water ran in the ditch, and the whole hard year fell away behind them like a thing survived. The machines had stopped when the world got hard. They had cracked and rusted and broken down and been hauled off for scrap, every last one. And the men who'd sold them and rented them and built their fortunes on them had been brought low or made over entire. But the horses had kept going. The horses had kept going in the killing heat, when every pump in the county failed, and through the storm in the dark, when 100 head of cattle would have smothered, and through the long winter and into the green spring, and they were keeping going. Still sound and patient, and trusting the hands that had earned them exactly the way Eli Whitaker had spent his whole laughed-at life saying they would. A machine stops when the world gets hard. A good horse keeps going when someone has earned its trust. Eli Whitaker died believing the world would never learn it, and his daughter taught it to them all, and it was true. And it would stay true long after every soul who'd laughed was dust. And that is the lesson Red Hollow finally learned and never once forgot.